everything that God has created, he created good. The problem is it's all under a curse. The problem is it's all under a curse, and we end up falling in sometimes to the curse. I mean, the same thing can be said about things like alcohol. It can be said about so many things. It can be said about food. Everything that God created, it is made by God, but everything is also under a curse. And so what I want you to understand is that worldliness really comes down to anything that stands in the way of God. Okay? Worldliness in our lives is anything that stands opposed to what God's will is in your life. And so living like the world can look different for each one of us, or it can look different culturally. It can look different. You know, just because you believe something about, and I'll use the eating of meat. That's one of the passages in Scripture, the eating of meat sacrificed to idols. What they finally decided was that it shouldn't be strangled and there shouldn't be any presence of blood. But if you in your good conscience, and your conscience could deal with eating that meat, then you had the freedom to do it. But if you in your own conscience couldn't deal with that, then don't do it. Okay? So now, bring that over. That means that almost anything could become worldly to us. I mean, it could be food. It could be some of the other things that we've talked about. It could be the fact that you have a weakness in spending money on so many clothes. Anything that is opposed to God's plan for your life is what we're talking about when it comes to worldliness. Now, why is that important? Because we need to understand, once again, that when he's talking about worldliness, when he's talking about the pattern of the world, that sometimes, unfortunately, what happens is we fall into that category as well. Some things become more important to us than Jesus himself. Now, continuing in the text, he says, that's why the world hates you. Remember the words I spoke to you. No servant is greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you also. If they obeyed my teaching, they will obey yours also. They will treat you this way because of my name, for they do not know the one who sent me. If I had not come and spoken to them, they would not be guilty of sin. Now, however, they have no excuse for their sin. Let me just pause there for a minute and tell you about verse 22. What Jesus is saying there is, now that I have come, they stand condemned. They stand condemned because the one who came, and the only one who can accuse them of sin, and why could he do that? Because he was sinless. The only way that God could even provide, I mean, God himself could make that accusation, but the only way was to send the one who would confront them with their own sin. The one who shows up and says, I have a right to say this because I have kept all the law, whereas none of you have. And so you stand condemned because I have been here. Verse 23, he who hates me hates my Father as well. If I had not done among them what no one else did, they would not be guilty of sin. But now they have seen these miracles, and yet they have hated both me and my Father. But this is to fulfill what is written in their law. They hated me without reason. When the Counselor comes, whom I will send to you from the Father, the Spirit of truth who goes out from the Father, he will testify about me, and you also must testify, for you have been with me from the beginning. All this I have told you, we're going into chapter 16. All this I have told you so that you will not go astray. They will put you out of the synagogue. In fact, a time is coming when anyone who kills you will think he's offering a service to God. They will do such things because they have not known the Father or me. I have told you this so that when the time comes, you will remember that I warned you. I did not tell you this at first because I was with you. Now, it may sound a little different, but I want to deal with that very, very last verse because a couple things come to mind. You know, by this time, John is really slowing down. I mean, I hope you see that. Over the last few weeks, we've even started to slow down a little bit, not looking at whole chapters. We're looking at little sections because, honestly, John is slowing down. The reason is because Jesus is starting to slow down a little bit. The time is near, and so when it's really important, Jesus is taking the time to make sure that his disciples understand what he's talking about. And so what he does here is he says, the time is near, and so here's what I want to tell you. The world's going to hate you just like they hate me. And then he comes down to this. He says, I tell you that now, so when the time comes, you will remember that I warned you. I did not tell you this at first because I was with you. You know, I stopped to think about that just a little bit. Part of the reason he didn't tell him at first is who's going to follow? I mean, honestly, who's going to follow? See, I think that's one of the frustrations maybe that we face here at CrossRoads, is that from time to time what I hear is that I teach hard. Okay, in other words, I'm not hard to understand, but that I teach hard. What I basically come about saying is that there are some obligations that we have in following Jesus. Listen, if Jesus is going to give up his life for you, then what he's asking is for you to give up your life for him. And sometimes that means that we have to teach things that are hard. You know? And so sometimes I hear that criticism, and don't come up to me afterwards and say, oh, I'm so sorry you hear that criticism. I signed up for it, okay? I signed up for it. I'm going to speak the truth. I'm going to preach the truth. I'm going to teach the truth. And doggone it, if there are people who think that it's way too hard, then find another place. See, honey, I'm growing. Didn't say there's the door or anything like that. Find somewhere where they'll teach your nice, soft little lesson and tell you Jesus loves you, and he does love you. But there's an obligation with our lives. And so people will say, you teach the hard stuff. And honestly, if I'm talking to someone who's outside of the church, you know part of what I talk about? I talk about Jesus' grace, talk about Jesus' love. And here's the deal, because they need to hear it. You know why? Because if you tell them that there's the chance that you're going to die for what you're signing up for, or there's the chance, and there's pretty much not just the chance, but it's pretty certain that the minister's going to stand up and be a little passionate sometimes and maybe make you feel a little bad, they may not want to be a part of it, so they need to hear about Jesus' love. But what I would expect from the church, from God's people, those who are growing in their relationship with him, is that you would come to understand that sometimes Jesus shows up to say, you need to straighten your life up. So, why Jesus do that? Part of it is to draw them in. But he also, the key part of it is this. He says, the reason I didn't tell you at first is because I'm here. Now, please understand that anything tough that came up along the way, Jesus was able to help them with. The reason I didn't tell you this at first, I want to warn you, I want you to expect it, I want you to know that it's coming. But the reason I didn't tell you at first is because I'm right here with you. We can handle anything that comes our way. Remember the storm on the sea? He was with them. Remember all the times that they were threatened and pushed out of town? He was with them. Remember whenever they were there and they saw Jesus being threatened along a cliff outside of Nazareth? He was with them. He was present, and he could have taken care of anything that they were struggling with. But now I want to warn you because I'm about to leave. I'm about to leave. I'm about to be killed, and here's what I want to tell you. You're going to follow the same path. Now, how would you like that? You're going to follow the same path. They're going to hate you and they're going to kill you. Well, why will they hate us? It's not in there, but you got to figure that one of the disciples probably asked. But Jesus, why will they hate us? I mean, we love God. We love God. We're trying to help people. Why will they hate us? The same thing is true today. Why do they hate us today? I mean, why is it, and we just had a great conversation, Robbie and I, with a fellow that came in this afternoon talking about some different things, talking about the freedoms that we have and how they're quickly disappearing. But why is it that Muslim people can go out into the roadway in New York City and bow down in prayer and they stop traffic, but if a Christian tried to do that, the police force would be there in a heartbeat and we would be tear gassed for being there? Why is that? Why is it that in our Christian universities. 106 of the first 108 universities in this country were founded on Christian morals. In fact, they were established as seminaries, religious schools to begin with. 106 of the first 108 universities. And now what we're seeing is that Christianity is being pushed out of the university, while Islam are bringing in departments of study. Money is being poured into our universities to educate. Muslim studies are beginning to be, they're showing up in high schools and in junior highs, so that we might understand our Muslim neighbors. And why is it that the world, then this country, why is it the country is turned against us? They're afraid of Islam. They're afraid to stand up against their religious rights, but they keep pushing us, those of us who don't mean any harm to anyone. In fact, we're trying to help. How are we trying to help? We're not simply pouring monies into universities. Do y'all know, and this is part of what Bob Russell spoke about at the conference that some of our young men went to. Do y'all know that the hospitals and the orphanages and all of those institutions that helped with sick and hurting people, do you know where they came out of? They came out of the Christian church. And then government stepped in and said, oh, no, you're making us look bad, and so we're going to take that. And now look what they're doing. They're not paying their bills to these nursing homes and to orphanages, and they're just not fulfilling it because they can't. Why is it that they hate us? Why is it that they hated the disciples? Well, there's a few reasons. One reason that Christianity is hated and not tolerated, even within our own society and especially around the world, is because we claim an exclusivity, that we're exclusive. See, and by the way, so do the Muslims. They'll lie to you. They will lie to you and tell you, oh, you're free to... No. You go back and you read from the Quran, and I will tell you what they think about you. They think that you either ought to be forced to convert, and if you won't convert, you ought to be dead. Now, that's not very nice, is it? Because you are infidels. You are dogs. I'm a dog. I'm a head dog. They want me dead or converted, but they just soon see me dead. Christianity isn't like that, is it? Okay, we have some weirdos who are out there and they want all Muslims dead. I don't want Muslims dead. I want to see them converted. I want to see them converted not by force, but I want to see them convinced that Jesus Christ is the Son of God and that He died for their sins and so that they give their lives to Him. That's Christianity. We're not really forceful in any way. Now, we've made some mistakes in the past, but we are not really forceful in any way. But we speak the truth, and the truth is there's one way to God, and that's through Jesus Christ, the way, the truth, and the life. That's part of what they don't like. They don't like the exclusiveness. Some people don't like the reminder of their sin. You've heard me say that before, and this was in a joking way. We have a lady who still sees me, and she says that I'm a walking guilt trip. Because when I come around and she's just behaving in a different way, then she feels so ashamed. And what I want to remind her of is, well, Jesus is walking with you all the time. You ought to pay attention to what He thinks about it, and not so much what Miles thinks about it. But honestly, if you're living the way that you should be living, you are a reminder of their own sin, and so they may not like you. They don't like the fact that you behave a little bit differently, that you don't get so angry. And so what they will start to do is try to push you into anger. And when you won't respond, then they just simply hate you. You think you're better than me. Well, I am better than you because I know Jesus Christ is my Lord and Savior, and that's the only thing that makes me better than you. But here's the good news. You could also accept Him as Lord and Savior, and then we'll be on an equal playing field. But they don't like that. See, you may set a good example in your marriage. And you may tell someone who is thinking about separating from their spouse to hang in there. And all of a sudden, that friend of yours no longer calls you because the advice that you gave was something that runs contrary to what they want to hear. They don't like us because we remind them of their own sin and guilt. We, by our very nature, condemn other people sometimes. And so we really don't need to go out of our, we ought to just be simply living it. We don't really need to go out of our way of pointing out their sin. And honestly, this is not new. I mean, even this thought is not new. If you go back to the beginning of the Bible, Cain killed Abel for the same reason. Abel was trying to do the best that he could in worshiping God and in giving to God and in providing and serving God, and Cain didn't like it. It made him look bad. And so what's he do? He kills his brother. And Jesus tells his disciples this same legacy will continue with them. Now here's the part we need to be prepared for. That same legacy may visit us. It may visit us very soon, maybe sooner than you think. And it shouldn't surprise us, because at the very beginning of the church, and honestly, folks, I want to be careful with this, because one of the things that you could be tempted to say, well, he's talking about just making sure that we are persecuted. No, I'm just asking the question, why aren't we persecuted? Okay? And in fact, if you think that I would run out, I'm going to describe to you just persecution over the last 20 centuries. If you think I would run out and fall on my knees and pray for all this to happen to us, you're wrong. In fact, Paul says that what we ought to pray for is peaceful times while we live. But I'm not going to trade those peaceful times for the truth. Okay? And I think sometimes that's what we've done. I'll just prep you for that. I think we've done that in this culture. All right, so Jesus says to his disciples, this legacy is going to continue with you. Very first Christian martyr. His name was Stephen. You can read about him in the book of Acts. Stephen was one of the 7 that was chosen. Philip and Stephen had the gift of being able to preach. They were the exhortation. They were able to speak and teach. And so Stephen did. He was called before the Sanhedrin one day. And Stephen began to preach. I mean, he began to tell them everything that they had done wrong. And essentially, it was kind of a little abbreviation of what Peter had preached on the day of Pentecost. I mean, if you really look at it, he says, this is Jesus Christ, and you crucified him. And so what they say is, we don't like what he's saying, so let's take him out and let's stone him. Now, stoning someone to death. Stoning basically was made up of taking the person to the outskirts of the city. Usually, most every town had some place that they could do it. Usually it had some little cliff or some little pit that was made in some cities that's where it took place. You took them to that place and you began to throw rocks at them. I mean, big rocks. And at some point, you pushed the person over the edge of that cliff. And that should have finished them off. All right? So Stephen is taken out and he's done it. And as they're throwing the rocks, Stephen looks up and you remember what all he says? I'm looking and I'm seeing the Son of God standing at the right hand of God. Or sitting. Which one is it, Jeff? Sitting? Yeah, because he sits down because his work is done. I think it's sitting. He looks up, he sees Jesus at the right hand of God. And then he even repeats Jesus' words from the cross. At one point he says, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. They don't know what they're doing. And evidently they didn't, because whenever persecution broke out, the church exploded. The church began to grow. There was one who was there, and he was approving of Stephen's death. His name was Saul. Saul became a great persecutor of the church. And the really cool thing about Jesus, and I think we need this reminder, the really cool thing about Jesus is that whenever we go through persecution, he does too. How do I know that? Because when Saul was riding to Damascus to further persecute the church, Jesus knocked him off of his horse. I mean, he's knocked down off the horse. He's blinded by this light, and he hears this voice, and the voice said, Saul, why do you persecute me? Now, that should be some great comfort, because what that means is that what Jesus is saying is that persecution is not just about what happens to his people, that Jesus says it happens to him as well while we're going through it. And then the other awesome thing is that Jesus, and it may not be here, but that Jesus takes care of the persecutor. And in this case, he knocks him right off the horse. Wouldn't you like to have been there? I mean, if you'd have been a friend of Stephen's or a person in the church, wouldn't it have been cool to be there, see Saul knocked off, and say, okay, now, yeah, you were picking on Stephen. What are you going to do now? And so Jesus, he changes He changes Paul just from that confrontation. Persecution is not just having or harming of Jesus' people. It is a harming of Jesus himself, and he will respond. How about Philip? Many people don't realize and know about Philip. Philip was imprisoned, he was beaten, whipped, and he was finally crucified. Matthew was killed with what was described as a long-handled axe with a sword on the end of it. And the description that a historian gave was that they beat him with the axe, and that didn't quite do the job, and so they turned it around and they ran him through with the sword, which was on the other end of this axe. That's how Matthew, the writer of the gospel, met his fate. James, the brother of Jesus, lived to be 94 years old, and he was beaten. He was taken out, and he was beaten, he was stoned. And then they threw him off of the cliff, and they thought that would kill him. 94 years old at the bottom of this cliff, and many people believe, tradition says that it was at Nazareth where Jesus would have been thrown off of that precipice, and so he's there at the bottom of it, and he's still alive. And so they take this club, and they throw it at him, and it hits him in the head, and that finally finishes him off. 94 years of age. Matthias is the one that's chosen to replace Judas. Matthias was stoned and then beheaded. And the Jewish historians tell us that Matthias, not only was he beheaded, but they took his head and they placed it on a post to warn any others about their treason. By the way, in our country, that was a popular thing to do. Either to hang someone at a crossroads and leave them hanging there as a warning, or to behead people and take their heads and put them on posts. Matthias, Andrew. I like Andrew's story. Andrew, how do you remember Andrew? He went and got his brother Peter. What else do you remember about Andrew? He's also the one that brought the kid with the fish and the 5 loaves. What else do you remember about Andrew? That should tell you enough about Andrew, because Andrew was always bringing people to Jesus. He was always introducing people to Jesus. Andrew was crucified. Now, before Andrew was crucified, normally before a crucifixion, what they would do, and they would what? No, but yeah, one of them was. We'll get to that. But Andrew wasn't beaten before he was crucified. The reason that they would beat people, and normally what it was 40 lashes. 40 lashes they had determined with the cat o' nine tails. 40 lashes would pretty much kill anybody. And so, I don't know if you know this, but on Jesus they stopped at 39 because he was almost dead. Some people could take 40 lashes, but the average man would die at 40 lashes. And so what they would do is they would beat them. And if they didn't survive the scourging with a cat o' nine tails, and I don't know, I've talked about the cat o' nine tails for so many years that I don't know if I've ever talked about it here. But the cat o' nine tails was basically a 9-tailed whip. And on the end of the, woven into the whip, and then on the end were usually some sort of metal barbs or hooks. And it was weighted with glass or stone. And that was woven into the whip. And so the whole idea was it was heavy. And as you would whip the person, the individual across the back, those hooks or those barbs would dig in. And the weight of it would help them to go in deep. And then as you pulled away, you would pull chunks of flesh out of them. And it's no wonder that they didn't survive this. Andrew is not beaten like that, because the whole idea was you beat them like that, then you put the cross on their back, you make it carry to the place that they're going to be crucified, you put them up on the cross, and within a few hours they'll be dead. And if they're not, they're weak enough that you go ahead and break their legs and they suffocate. And so what you have in Andrew is that he hangs on the cross for 2 days. For 2 days he is hung on the cross. And do you know what he does the whole time he's on the cross? Because people come out to see Andrew on the cross. And you know what he does? He preaches. And you want to know the really amazing thing, the cool thing? Is that there were people who accepted Christ because of his preaching. They accepted Jesus. And some of them, you got to know, went on to be crucified right along with him. But some of them accepted Christ. Many people there accepted Jesus because Stephen had the courage to go ahead and preach. What are they going to do to me? Mark is described as being torn to pieces by a mob. Now, I can't even imagine that. But that he was destroyed by a mob of people and he was torn limb from limb by them. Jude was crucified. Bartholomew was beaten, crucified, and then beheaded. Thomas was run through with a spear. Luke was hanged for his belief in following Christ. The Apostle Peter was crucified upside down in Rome. The story is told that he was taken there, he was imprisoned and tried, and when the crucifixion, when the sentence came down as crucifixion, Peter made the request to be crucified with his head down because he was not worthy to be crucified in the same manner that his Lord was. And then James is probably one of my favorite stories. Let me tell you about John first. John lived to be 100 years old. Someone asked me that the other day. I didn't know, but 100 years old. He was boiled in oil. We know that. He survived that, and so they exiled him to Patmos. The only of the disciples who was not martyred for his faith. James the Greater. He's the only one that the Bible tells us about his death as far as being an apostle. I mean, Stephen's death is recorded, of course. But the only apostle whose death is recorded for us is Acts chapter 12, and it's James the Greater. James the son of Alphaeus. James the brother of John. James was seized by King Agrippa. A Roman official had stepped forward and accused James of treason. Now let me explain to you that that's exactly what they would do. Is that it was treason. It was that they stood against the nation of Rome. And so James is accused of this by this Roman official. And so he's taken before King Agrippa, and King Agrippa says, "You need to be beheaded. Do you have any last words?" James says, "Yes, I do. I want to tell you the gospel. I want to tell you about Jesus." And so he proceeds to tell him about Jesus and the gospel and how Jesus died upon the cross and he gave his life for our sins. And then he said to Agrippa, "You, king, are a sinful man, and you will spend your eternity in hell unless you repent and give your life to Christ. And now before I die, I only wish to know your answer." And Agrippa, of course, turned him down. But the interesting thing is that the official, the Roman official who accused him, saw his boldness, saw his courage, and heard the message that he preached. So that on the way to James being beheaded, the official gives his life to Jesus. And a Roman official lost his head that same day because he gave his faith at James' last preaching. Jesus says to the disciples, that's how it's going to be. I need to tell you that, as I've already said, the Bible only records one of their deaths, and the rest of it's through Jewish tradition and history. But we're very certain that these men died martyrs' deaths because of what they believed. In fact, it's pretty amazing to me. Chuck Colson, who just passed away this past weekend, Chuck Colson once said, he once said that what finally brought him to the realization that Jesus was who he said that he was is that being through Watergate, and those of you who may remember, Colson was imprisoned for his role in Watergate. He said, within a few days of Watergate, the scandal, it all started to fall apart. Because one by one, people were being taken in. They were being questioned. They were being examined or cross-examined and things. And they wouldn't stand for a lie. And he said, that's what finally convinced me that Jesus was who he said that he was. Because men do not die for a lie. And all of these men who witnessed Jesus and his life and his death, his resurrection, they died for their faith. Now, along the line, a king, an emperor by the name of Nero came on the scene. And Nero really, he just upped the whole persecution game. Nero was a sociopath, really. I mean, he was crazy. How do we know he was crazy? Because if you know the story, we don't really know that he set Rome on fire, but something happened that he set Rome. Here's what he didn't do. He didn't call for anyone to put it out. I mean, he didn't respond in the emergency. In fact, the story about him actually playing the violin while Rome was burning is very true. He played that instrument while it was burning. He was nuts. Now, what he did was later on, he let Rome basically burn to the ground. Then he began to rebuild it, and he took credit for it, and people praised him for it because here's a good king. He's providing for us in this way. Now, that wasn't all the case. When Rome first burned down, they came to Nero. They're upset with him. Why didn't you stop this? What happened? Are you crazy? And he says, you know what? There is this group of people. They talk about their God being a consuming fire. I bet it was them. And he says to the crowds, it was the Christians who set fire to the city. And so Rome began this great persecution of the people because they wouldn't worship Caesar as God. But persecution has continued down through the ages. In fact, in the 2nd century, there was a group of people who were known because they were willing to be martyred for their faith. I'm not so sure that God teaches us to go out and to intentionally lose our lives for that, because I think he has a bigger purpose for us. But honestly, they were prepared to die. Agatha was one young lady's name, and Agatha was a virgin. She had been approached by a Roman official who wanted to have relations with her, but she had sworn herself to marriage. She was a Christian, and she would not give up her chastity, and so he had her in prison. He had her living with a woman who owned a brothel, and even offering opportunities for her to take care of men who came into that place, and she still refused. And the official gave her one more opportunity, and she would not give herself over in that way. Her virginity was too important, and her following Jesus Christ was too important to her. And so he had her lashed, he had her burned with hot irons, and then she was stoned to death, and she did not die immediately, but they took her back to her cell. They placed her in the cell, and she died a slow, painful death from the wounds that she had received, simply because she stood by her conviction. Perpetua was another. Perpetua was kind of a famous story. Perpetua was several months pregnant when she was taken and given the choice to either state that Caesar was Lord or to not. And she did not. She would not recant or deny Christ. Wow. And so Perpetua was taken to an auditorium or a coliseum, not unlike the Colosseum. And she was placed there, and wild boars were released upon her, goring and killing her and her child because of her faith. I know that these are hard stories to hear for some people, but it continues. In fact, some people have this. I made this statement a few weeks ago, and people were just like, "What?" In the 20th century, 1900 to 2000, there have been more martyrs for the Christian faith than the first 19 centuries combined. And that's hard for people to believe. It's hard for people here to believe, and the reason is because we don't suffer this sort of martyrdom. But in China, just as an example, this has been a few years ago, in 2006, 400 house churches were bulldozed to the ground. 400 house churches were bulldozed to the ground, and that's 400 people's livelihoods, because that's where they live. They don't meet in auditoriums like this because they can't. It's illegal for them to meet. And so they meet in homes, and so 400 homes were bulldozed where churches met. 35 pastors were arrested and are now, or in the last few years, well, no, it would have been 2008, they would have gotten out of this. 2008, from 2006 to 2008, they were in institutions being re-educated into communism. In other words, being brainwashed back into communism. In Pakistan, 3 years ago, 15 young women were abducted after they left the factory in which they worked. 7 of those young women were Muslim. They were taken to a field, and the Muslim young ladies were released. The 8 young Christian women who were left were brutalized for the next several hours and beaten. And then they were finally released. They were told not to go to the police because if they did, it would be worse. They decided to go to the police. And so they went to the police. The factory where they worked, the guy who owned the factory, found out that they were going to the police, and he told them, if you do, then you will lose your jobs. They still made the decision to go. These 8 young ladies were not only brutally assaulted and beaten, but they lost their jobs because of their Christian faith, along with 60 other Christians at the plant who stood up to the boss. 68 people lost their jobs. In Mexico, a pastor was visiting on a mission team, and one of the local ministers was speaking. And in Mexico, he had been called out of the meeting, of the conference. And when he came back in, he was visibly upset, and they asked what had happened, and this pastor said, "They have kidnapped my son." This pastor that was visiting said, "Why did they kidnap your child?" And he said, "Because in our country right now, they will kidnap children of wealthy businessmen and wealthy people. But once they've exhausted that, now what they've begun to do is they target the pastors and the leaders of churches. They target their children because what they know is that the church will come together and they will pay a ransom that is much more than what some of the business owners here can pay." The pastor from the United States said to him, "What will happen if you don't pay the ransom?" And they said, "They will kill my son." "Will they really kill him?" "Yes, they will kill my son." And then the pastor said, "I said something really foolish." I said, "Well, why don't you call the police?" And he said, "It's probably the police who have kidnapped my child." In India, there are 330, according to Ravi Zacharias, 330 million gods that the Hindus worship in India. And so up in one of the mountain regions, a pastor there, there's one particular god in which a demon will enter into a female's body. They don't know which female it would be, but for the next week, this woman will dance continuously. She will lose weight. She will be on the verge of death whenever the ceremony is over, but she is completely consumed and possessed by this demon. And the pastor was so moved in the middle of the ceremony, he went out and he cast out that demon. He cast out the demon, and there were many people in that village that gave their lives to Jesus Christ. And he said to this mission board, "I need your prayers because now I have to go back there." Does that remind you of anything? You remember Paul? Paul is walking through the city and a girl is prophesying behind him, and Paul turns around and says, "In the name of Jesus Christ, come out of her." And they took Paul out and stoned him because of it. So he says, "Pray for me. Pray for me because I'm going back and my life is going to be difficult." Well, here's the question I think it leads us to. Why are we hated? Here's the second question. Why are these things not happening to us? Why are the things I just described not happening here? There's only 2 or 3 possibilities. One is, Jesus says in this text, if you do what I say, if you live the way that I say you should live, then you will be hated, you will be persecuted. And so maybe we aren't looking like we should. We're not living like we should. Now, I want to go back and remind you, I am certainly not praying for any persecution to break out. I am simply saying that as followers of Jesus Christ, we ought to look more like Him. And if persecution comes, then so be it. He will help us to endure. Now, some would say, because God is protecting us. I will repeat this, and I will repeat it over and over again. There's no one that's any more patriotic than I am until it comes to the fact that I belong to another kingdom, and it's not necessarily one of this earth. And if that hurts someone's feeling in here, that I will salute the cross before I will salute the United States flag, you better get used to it. Because my allegiance is to the Lamb of God and to no one else. That doesn't mean that I'm not happy to live in a free nation. It's just that I'm going to take advantage of my freedom. And that gives me the freedom to proclaim that He alone is King. He is the only one. And no one is going to tell me to bow to the flag or anything else. Or to any sort of thought process by which they will present shaded by those colors. Because we're headed that way. We are headed in that direction. And so for those that are in the church, it says because God is protecting us. I want to ask why. Why in the world would God be protecting this nation? He is no respecter of persons. He is not a respecter of nations either. Why in the world is He protecting? I remember, I've told you this story before. I had a huge problem whenever I was at Lincoln First. I'd sit in the crowd. I could be singing on the stage. I could be preaching. I could be teaching a lesson. I could be doing all sorts of those things, and I would be completely comfortable. But you put me in the middle of the crowd with 1,500 people around me, and I felt like every eye was upon me. And I remember going in, and that's weird thinking, by the way. That's strange thinking. It's not rational. Now here's the truth of it. I'm willing to admit my irrationality. Are you? And so I sat there in the crowd wondering why all these eyes were upon me. And I went to Tom Ewald, and I love Tom Ewald's answer. Tom said, "What makes you think you're so important?" And you know what? I realized that I'm not that important. So I want to turn around. I want to ask you that same question. What makes you think the United States of America is that important? I'm not trying to be harsh with it. I am as patriotic. It's the nation which I was born. It's the greatest nation, in my opinion. It's the greatest nation in the world that ever has been. But I will tell you this is not our final destination. This is not the place where we will dwell. There is a kingdom that is coming, and it is here now, and Jesus sits upon His throne, and I am a part of that kingdom and that movement, and I will pledge my allegiance there first and foremost. And if it need be, He will be the only one who receives my allegiance if we come to that point in this nation. And we might. You know why? Because we are not that important. God is protecting us. That's ridiculous. He's watching people in other nations who are living for Him, and they're suffering. I'll tell you what I believe, why it's not happening here, because we are incredibly blessed. Now, don't misunderstand that. We have been incredibly blessed. We have freedom in this nation. We have not taken advantage of those freedoms. And what we have become is soft. We are soft all the way around. We're soft in our nation. Do you realize that most people in this nation they don't know who the world leaders are? People from around the world know who our leaders are. There's a guy, he played a terrible joke. It just shows how silly American people can be. But he was in Washington, D.C., and he was telling people that he was the Prime Minister of Australia, and people believed him. People from all over the nation. Well, I'm from Texas, but welcome to our nation. Hope you enjoy your time while you're here. We have become soft, and we are known as being soft, and the church is soft here. Jesus said, when you pray, pray in this manner. Give us this day our daily bread. We can't even pray for daily bread, and you know why? Because we don't need it. I have bread for today. I have bread for tomorrow. I have bread for the next day. In fact, if I really wanted to go down to the freezer and then raid the kitchen pantry, I can find enough food until Jesus comes back. We're soft.